Members, we now come to part two. This is debate on clauses 39 to 44 and schedules 2 to 5. And the question is that part two stand part.
Mr. Chair.
I call Chris Farfoy.
Mr. Chair, thank you. To take some calls to part two of this Standards and Accreditation Bill. Mr. Chair, I would like to focus on clause 40, which is the disestablishment of the Standards Council. It's only a one-line clause, two-line clause, Mr. Chair, but this, the Standard Council continued under Section 3 of the Standards Act 1988 is disestablished. Mr. Chair, that sets up the ability for this government to set up a new body which is housed within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and this is the New Zealand Standards Executive. And this is the body, Mr. Chair, that will be replacing the Standards Council, and it's that lack of independence because of the housing within MB that we have a problem with. Mr. Chair, just as I was speaking to part one, there is massive concern that we're losing the Standards Council and we're having a new entity within MB, the New Zealand Standards Executive. And Mr. Chair, I just wanted to continue some concerns from the Building Industry Federation around losing the Standards Council. In their submission, again, Mr. Chair, and quoting from it, it says, and I want to say just that it is a very brave submission from the Building Industry Federation, because they say that this bill breaks with historical global practice that the building and construction sector was and is concerned that the position of executive is now to be filled by an executive of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Development, or MB, appointed by the Chief Executive of that ministry. Mr. Chair, the Building Industry Federation, in their submission to the Select Committee, which is the public's opportunity to come and have their say, says the industry does not question the integrity of the Chief Executive of MB, but is concerned that the appointment process and the subsequent administrative tenure of the appointee will be influenced significantly and dominated by public sector and government requirements at the expense of industry requirements and needs. Mr. Chair, why has this government that always claims it's close to industry, in touch with industry, completely and utterly ignored the many voices of industry when it comes to this bill at Select Committee, and completely and utterly ignored their concerns around independence, around whether or not the new structure affords itself to cover costs, and completely and utterly ignored it because it has made no amendments to this piece of legislation, or no substantive amendments to this piece of legislation at all after it left the Select Committee. Mr. Chair, they have been ignored, and I think that that is a mistake and a missed opportunity from this government to make sure that this piece of legislation was as good as it could have been. It is a missed opportunity, Mr. Chair, and one that the government should have seen coming at the Select Committee stage. Mr. Chair, the clause 40 again around the disestablishment of the council does that because, and the main aim was because of the financial viability of the New Zealand Standards Council. Again, in the Select Committee process, we heard from a number of submitters who questioned whether or not the new structure within MB would actually solve that problem, and a number of my colleagues have raised this issue. I think Dr. David Clark did, and I certainly my colleague Stuart Nash did. Also, this issue was raised by Diane Bagley, who I have quoted her submission extensively through this debate, who's someone with around 20 years experience in this area, and who has grave concerns not just about the financial sustainability of the standards process, but also, as we share, concerns around the independence. Ms Bagley said in her submission, which she sent to the Select Committee, I must add, on the 1st of January, so concerned she was about this piece of legislation that on New Year's Day she thought she'd send her submission in. And she went on to say in her submission that there is no guarantee that the new structure will in the long run save public money rather than merely shift it from one part of the budget to another. The effect on overall expenditure will be difficult to determine, given that there will be practical limitations to the specificity of the financial reporting within MB. Mr. Chair, there's another clear reason there that why this government should have taken heed of a number of the recommendations from the submitters at the Select Committee. Clause 40 does go to disestablishing the New Zealand Standards Council. A number of, Mr Chair?
Chris Farfoy.
A number of the submitters said we shouldn't have been doing this. And the arrogance of the government to not see that and to push on through, and Mr Bishop can laugh, but his members sat around that table and listened to the industry submitters come along, and for them it was an important chance to have their say. It's an important part of the democratic process. It's scrutiny of legislation by the people who it's going to be most affected, but this government did nothing. It pushed on and didn't listen to people with decades more experience of this sector than people sitting around that Select Committee table. I'm glad to say that we did on this side of the House. We did listen to those concerns. We hoped that the government was going to make changes through a supplementary order paper that the government may have brought through, but to this date we have said nothing. And to this date will probably continue to vote against this piece of legislation. Mr Chair, this is a missed opportunity from this government. I think earlier on the Minister and the Chair said that the Standards Council, which is being disestablished again under this clause 40, Mr Chair, was not visible at all, and that was one of the problems that the government was trying to solve. And so, Mr Chair, as I said in part 1, the solution that the government had to that problem was a novel one. It wasn't to continue to keep it independent. It wasn't giving them more funding to ensure that it was financially sustainable. It was to morph it into a department which is probably the biggest department in the country, MB. It's taken in 5 or 6 other government departments: immigration, labour, building, housing, economic development. So the problem that was there was visibility. So this government said, well, if it's not visible, let's put it in MB where it will be even more invisible. Even more invisible. And I don't think those people who came, when those organisations who came to submit, who are concerned about the disestablishment of the New Zealand Council will be impressed. They weren't impressed certainly at the Select Committee stage. I think they left hopeful that the government would listen, but they didn't, because there's nothing in this piece of legislation that in any way goes to meet their concerns that they had at the Select Committee, and those have been well traversed. Mr Chair, this is a government that always says it's actually in most areas trying to push responsibility away, whether it be social bonds, whether it be social housing. They're trying to say less government is better. But in this instance, Mr Chair, they're saying, well, that's an independent body and let's morph it into the Ministry of Building, Business, Innovation and Employment. That doesn't make sense to us. It means because we're trying to solve one problem around costs, we're creating another fundamental problem around independence. And the industry wants independence to make sure that we have credibility on the international stage when it comes to our standard setting. And we've got huge credibility around there. We have, and we had submissions from people to the Select Committee, and they did have concerns. And I'll just quote one more of those, Mr Chair, and that was Diane Bagley again. She said that I oppose this establishment of the Standards Council. I do not consider that the provisions set out for the establishment of the standards functions within the MB can adequately control the risks associated with the new structure. Mr Chair, this is a case where this government has burned the village to save the village. We're not convinced it is going to solve the issue around costs. And we certainly know that they've created another issue around independence, one that is fundamental and one that puts our reputation in this area seriously at risk.
Mr Chairman.